Timothy Holloway.
And I'm Riley Judd.
And welcome back to Know Your Nonsense. This is our second episode. Woot woot. This is going to be a great time.
Yeah.
And so we're just going to kind of get right into it. But first, we didn't mention in our intro episode how long we would be researching for episodes like this. This is the first in our standard rotation cycle of 3 different kinds of episodes. And we will be allowing each other to research from 4 hours to 12 hours on topics for the episodes where we give each other a topic. So I have given Riley this topic. We have both had anywhere in the range of 4 to 12 hours to research this and figure everything out we can and learn what we can about this. Yeah. I will have to do the same this next week.
Indeed. How much did you research for this one?
I researched about 5.5, 6 hours.
5.5, 6? I did 4.
Okay, yeah, okay. So, not much time. Again, this is to kind of encourage you. Go out, research in your free time, learn stuff. It's fun.
Oh, yeah, it is.
So,
it's wild.
Without further ado, let's get talking about what we researched. And if you remember, the hint I gave was a look into light old architecture, which we had some guesses at Gothic architecture. Really, really dadgum close.
It was really close.
But what we are talking about today is cathedrals.
Whoa,
the
cathedrals.
History of, the architecture of a little bit. Everything going along with that. So, without further ado, I just said that twice.
Twice.
It's fine. Riley, give us an overview.
Oh, man. Y'all strap in, because it's gonna be a ride. So first, we need to clear up some misconceptions about what a cathedral is. I know a lot of you, like me, probably have some wonderful buildings that come to mind, and it's like, yes, that is a cathedral. Which, you're probably right, but that's not really what makes a cathedral. So, the etymology behind the word cathedral comes from the word cathedra. A cathedra is the bishop's official seat. So, a cathedral is really just any church where a bishop resides. So, obviously, this mostly will pertain to religions that have bishops, such as, Catholic, Anglican, and Eastern Orthodox. So, the origin of cathedrals is kind of hard to pin down. Obviously, it's going to start once we start getting bishops, but there's a lot of ambiguity around when, the buildings started being referred to as cathedrals. It's really hard. So some say that it came about during the age of Constantine the Great, which was, 306 to 337 AD. Some people say even earlier than that, as early as the third Pope, Anacletus, which was 79 to 92 AD. And then you have some people saying the first ever bishop was the Bishop of Rome, Evaristus, which was 99 to 107. So nobody really knows. It's a lot. So there are some other qualifications for being a cathedral. However, the main one, and the one that we're going to stick to for simplicity's sake, is the residence of a bishop. So, for the sake of discussion, we are going to be going from Constantine. So we're going to start in the Constantine era. So, taking a trip down history lane, because it is important in the history of cathedrals, in 313, Constantine passed religious toleration for Christianity. And then in 391, a bunch of years later, his successor, Theodosius, made it the official religion of Rome. So, when this happened, obviously, we had a bunch of, bishops and such around Rome. However, in around 400, the Roman rule disappeared as the Anglo-Saxons came in and said, ooh, you got some lovely land here. Would be a shame if somebody just came along and stole it.
Oh, gosh.
So they basically came in, and I didn't get to research them all, which was a shame, but apparently there were 5 great crises that cathedrals faced, and this was the first, when the Anglicans came in and they just destroyed everything. So, it's important to note that before this, cathedrals weren't necessarily referring to the buildings. So we're getting to that. So after the Anglo-Saxons have marched in, Pope Gregory in 596 sent the Italian monk Augustine to reconvert the English. He's like, go make them Christian again. Well, this actually kind of worked out really well because there was a king, Ethelbert, who had married a Frankish princess named Bertha, who had a bishop that she brought along with her named Leodhard. So he was most likely there to re-establish the clergy and not just be her own personal chaplain. So he had already kind of laid some of the groundwork for this. Ethelbert was already very friendly towards Christians, so Augustine was able to baptize him, and then Ethelbert happily gave him some churches, and so he was able to start setting up Gregory's plans. So during this time, there was very little difference between a cathedral, so, the bishops and where people worshipped there, and monasteries, like monks. The main difference was the type of people who ran them. So in monasteries, the monks, they secluded themselves, their buildings were far away from the world, they didn't interact with the world.
Right.
Meanwhile, in cathedrals, you had what was known as secular clergy, which just meant that they went out into the world and did things. And so that's kind of where this distinction came in. They needed a way to distinguish, bishops and secular clergy's buildings from monasteries and monks. So originally, cathedral, like cathedra, that word, the bishop's seat, that was used as an adjective. So it was basically the bishop's seat church. So go to the bishop's church. And
Makes
eventually,
sense,
and then it eventually blended into just becoming the word for the building. And so when that happened, that's when some of the buildings were very good buildings, but they weren't as grand or beautiful as we kind of think of cathedrals, because the church was very poor at this time. They just kind of came back to the Anglo-Saxon-owned England. This is mostly in England. And they were like, hey, can we have our decrepit pieces of land back to build a building, please? And the Anglo-Saxons were like, maybe, possibly, sure. So
that's one way of putting it.
Yeah, and then finally, once everything was kind of, sort of in order, the Norse came in and beat up all the Anglo-Saxons. And so a bunch of cathedrals got beat up again. And so that was the second crisis. So, but they constantly went through this. Like, they would be torn down, cathedrals would be beat up, bishops would no longer be in charge, and then they would put themselves back together. So, after the Norse, the Norse was around the 1000, 1100s, 1200s, in that area. And so this is around the time when different types of artistic architecture were really making a lot of advancements. And so they were starting to be able to make richer and grander cathedrals for people to come worship in. So when it comes to the buildings, so that's the history of the buildings. When it comes to the building themselves, originally because they were from Rome, they were styled after Roman architecture. And so it was basically just a long hallway. That is known as a basilica. Just a long hallway for people to gather in. That was a very Roman thing. So eventually, they added a cross section so their buildings would look like churches. Not churches, crosses from the inside.
From the inside and the aerial.
Yeah, from the inside and the aerial, it would look like a cross. This is known as the cruciform plan. We'll get more into the in-depths of the interior and exterior in a bit. So basically, all you need to know, there's a bunch of styles of cathedrals. They followed the art movements of the day, starting with Romanesque, moving to Gothic, and then you would get some others as well, such as Baroque or Rococo. We won't really get into those because they're not quite as popular. The two most popular cathedral styles that you will want to know are Romanesque and Gothic. Romanesque cathedrals are based off of Roman architecture. Gothic architecture. So their popularity again, we're kind of talking in English terms, so this is all happening in England. In the south of England, you would have a lot of Romanesque churches, because with Romanesque churches, they were first most notably categorized by their round arches. So all the arches in their buildings were very round at the top. So that's how you can tell it's a Romanesque building, as well as they would have really thick stone, which would keep the interior cool, because in the south it was a lot warmer. And so they wanted to have these nice, cool places for people to come into. They would have very narrow windows, not the big, grand, light letting in windows of Gothic architecture. They would usually have a wooden roof, and these were usually built with less money because the south was poorer than the north. In the north, you would have Gothic architecture, which is characterized mostly by its pointed arches. So if you need a difference between, is this a Romanesque cathedral or is this a Gothic cathedral, look at any archway. If the top is round, it's Romanesque. If it's pointed, it's Gothic.
It's a good way to tell.
It's a very easy way to do it.
Easy way to remember.
And the second is, if there's a lot of windows, it is Gothic. Gothic is known for trying to let in as much light as possible, which this worked really well in the north because the north was colder, so they wanted to have more light in, so it would be a little warmer inside. They would usually have a stone roof, so theirs were a lot more sturdy than the south, but this was able to be done because they had more money. So uses for a cathedral. Cathedrals were very important buildings, and they still are very important buildings.
So much.
But back in the day, they would be used for royal or religious announcements, so if the king has to make any sort of announcement, or if the bishop or the pope has to make any announcement, people would come to the cathedral so they could get that announcement. They would be used as courthouses sometimes. They would be used as schools. There was almost always some children living in a cathedral, learning how to maintain the cathedral as well as other things. If it was raining, they would sometimes move the farmer's market inside. They would have job fairs. The place was used for safety. They would sometimes go in there in times of war. That was like a safe house. And also in times of war and times of tragedy, it was used as a hospital. So they would take the wounded and the sick and the injured there so people could take care of them. So in modern times, obviously we have come a long way since then. There are, according to the Catholic website, I believe it's the official Catholic website, there are 3,054 cathedrals.
Holy crap.
It's a lot.
That's a lot of cathedrals.
Yes. But those are the main cathedrals, so that's where the bishop resides. You also have 324 co-cathedrals, which means they share the bishop's seat with another cathedral. You have 47 pro-cathedrals, which these are kind of interesting. They're like temporary cathedrals. They have the same powers that a cathedral will have, but usually they're in like Catholic missionary jurisdiction, but they don't have their full title of cathedral yet. So then there are 495 former cathedrals, so they no longer hold the same status that they used to have because they no longer have a bishop residing. So Brazil has the most cathedrals. This was interesting. I thought it was Italy. It is not. Brazil has the most with 276 cathedrals, followed by Italy with 228. Italy, however, does have the most co-cathedrals and former cathedrals. So when it comes to all the parts, the innards of the cathedrals, if you were wanting to picture the floor plan of a cathedral, like I said, picture a cross. You take a cross, and this is very important, tip it over to the right. It has to go to the right. So the bar of the cross is going to be on your right side, not your left. So entering from the left, you're going to have the narthex, which is the large entrance area. Next to the narthex, you will have the nave, which is the big aisle. So that's like the long bar of the cross that you have knocked over. On either side of the nave, so on the top and bottom of our knocked over cross, is the aisles. So that's the space for people to walk so they can get to their seats in the nave. So generally speaking, you will have two towers flanking the entrance. So you would come in, you have 2 towers, nave, narthex followed by the nave. So then you have the apse. So that's the rounded end of the nave. So you have passed the bar of the cross. So you've passed the cross. So you've gone past that intersection. And you will have a rounded area, which that is where the altar is, the bishop's seat is. That's where those things are. Behind that, you will have the ambulatory, which is a circle passageway for people to go behind the apse. So this will get you to the next item, which is chevettes. So you have chapels behind the main chapel, which is the apse and the nave and all of that. So behind that, accessed by the ambulatory, is chevettes, which is usually, those chapels are usually used for, honoring specific saints and things like that. So the bar, so you've knocked over the cross, the vertical bar, the smaller one, that is known as the transept. And the middle of that, where that meets the nave, that is known as the crossing. So fun fact there. You have on the walls, so on the big bar of our knocked over cross, on the top and bottom, so on the walls, at the highest points, you have the clerestory windows, which are windows along those aisles, achieving that Gothic look. Those windows are just there to let in as much light as possible. Under those windows, you would have the triforium, which is where women and nuns would walk. So it's kind of an raised platform for them to go around. You will then, under that, have piers, which are columns that form pointed arches that would support the building, giving it, again, that classic Gothic look. So going to the external of the cathedrals, this is pertaining to Gothic cathedrals. Romanesque cathedrals would have some of these things, but the thing that they would both have in common is buttresses. Both Romanesque and Gothic cathedrals would have buttresses, which are external tall structures that would support the walls. So in Gothic architecture, they took this to the extreme. They wanted to make them very pretty. So their buttresses were topped with a spire or a pinnacle. So it would bring it to a nice point. And Gothic architecture is also known for their flying buttresses, which they would have arches that would connect the buttress to the cathedral wall. So the cathedral wall from the outside, how it kind of would taper in to a point, the buttress would be touching the wall, but only for part of the cathedral. Once the cathedral started coming in, they would add these arches. Those are the flying buttresses. And then obviously you would also have a very iconic Rosetta window, usually on your Gothic architecture cathedral. A just nice central round window of stained glass that is very pretty. So other than that, that's all the basic information of cathedrals. Some specific cathedral information for you. So St. Peter's Basilica is the largest cathedral in Europe. It's also the home of Michelangelo's very famous dome. It's a very famous piece of architecture. Set to be the tallest church building in the world is the Sagrada Familia Cathedral, which began construction in 1882. It is still being constructed, set to be finished in 2026. So be on the lookout for that in a few years.
Breaking news.
News. And then a couple other popular ones. Everybody has some cathedrals that they know, like the Hagia Sophia in Turkey, and then obviously the Notre Dame in Paris. So there are very iconic cathedrals that now you can appreciate how they became the iconic buildings that they are. And then just another fun thing, the Notre Dame was actually going to be destroyed before, the fire happened and it kind of got destroyed. But this is sad. So it was a terrible day. But it would have happened a lot sooner. Kind of during the French Revolution, it had fallen into disarray, and during the French Revolution, they wanted to distance themselves from anything of past France. So that meant destroying a lot of Gothic architecture, of which the Notre Dame was probably the most prevalent. Well, Victor Hugo, the man who wrote The Hunchback of Notre Dame, really liked the Notre Dame. He didn't want to see it destroyed, so he basically wrote a fan fiction of the building and published it and said, hey guys, read my fan fiction, please don't destroy the building I love. And everybody did. They were like, oh wow, this is a wonderful story, why do we want to get rid of this again? So he almost single-handedly saved the Notre Dame and a lot of other Gothic architecture in France. And so Gothic architecture is probably the most prevalent of cathedral architecture. That's generally what you think of when you think cathedral. And so it's so crazy to think of how the world might look in terms of cathedrals today, like what kind of styles they would be in if that destruction of Gothic architecture had happened. But that is your basic overview of cathedrals.
Yeah, good job. You did really good covering a lot of the stuff about cathedrals.
Thank you.
Some things I want to go ahead and just slide in there, not really as a correction mostly, more of as just like, hey, a little bit more information on these topics that you just touched on. Part of the making a cathedral, what a cathedral is, you talked about the cathedra and the bishop's seat, and you've mentioned where that is, how it's often, right before the apse and everything.
Yes.
Something else that I had found was the Pope must approve that it becomes a cathedral.
Yes.
That is important to them.
Yes.
So, like, a bishop of a diocese, which is like, I don't want to call it parish because I know that's a different word for something else.
It's basically just the area that the bishop presides over.
Right, yeah. It's like his kingdom.
Yes.
His holy kingdom.
Yes. It's not really a kingdom. It's just the area he's religiously in charge of.
Right. He can kind of request and even make the decision to start construction on cathedral is what I found, but the Pope still has to approve that it actually becomes a cathedral.
Yes.
So that's a fun little thing to throw in there. Something else, you mentioned the monasteries and everything along with that. I did find that for a while there was a time when a cathedral could be the principal church of a monastery. Didn't necessarily have the bishop.
Yes.
It was a fun little exception to the rule, I guess.
Yeah. Well, the rule wasn't really set in place quite
yet. It was like
then.
Kind of fluxing.
Yeah, the rules for becoming a cathedral, like with the bishop and officially approved by the church, that, like, when all of the destruction was happening and people were kicking each other out of England left and right, it was very hard for any sort of order in the church. So setting up those kind of rules were very difficult. So it did take a while for those rules to really come into effect. For sure.
It was a struggle for certain. I do not envy the people who were in charge at that time. Concerning the construction of cathedrals, which you had brought up a little bit, how sometimes they were thrown together, other times they took a lot longer, which I think is important to say, just because, we see buildings go up and they take 1, 2, 3 years if they're really big.
Yeah.
Cathedrals, the fast ones, took 20 years.
Yeah.
So that's just, a little side thing. Specifically, I'm thinking of Notre Dame de Chartres, which, another fun fact, which I know you already know, but, just in case they don't, there are a lot of Notre Dame cathedrals.
Yes.
Fun fact. There's Notre Dame de Paris, or Paris, as they would say. So I'm told.
Do you know what Notre Dame, means?
Yeah, it means Our Lady.
Oh, okay, yeah.
The Lady of Paris, just pretty much.
Okay.
So yeah, that's the famous one, the one that sadly burned a lot just last year, 2 years ago. Last year.
It was last year.
Wow.
COVID.
Time flies. Amen. But yeah, there is a lot of different Notre Dame cathedrals sharing the same name. I think some of them even share similar architects, but don't quote me on that. That was just something I remember hearing from ages ago, so don't quote me on that one.
Our failed research coming into play.
Yeah, a little bit. We had a little bit of time. Not as much as I wanted. But where I was going with that, the Notre Dame de Paris took over 200 years to build.
Oh, yeah.
So it went from the beginning of Gothic architecture and when that was popular straight to the end.
Yes.
Like, people were already kind of sick of the stuff when Notre Dame was finished. And then Notre Dame de Chartres, which is only about, It's close to Paris, not super far away, but another Notre Dame Cathedral. That one took 20 years. Just the kind of differences there. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, and like I mentioned, the Sagrada Familia, that is still under construction, and it's also taking 200 plus years to build. And this is with modern architecture techniques. Like, they are using cranes and technology, and it's still taking them 200 years because they are putting that kind of time and effort into these buildings.
Yeah, that's how important these are, and it's really cool that they're still doing that. It's kind of awesome. I wish we would do that more, honestly.
Yeah, with other buildings and other things.
Yeah,
put some importance behind them.
Exactly. My history teacher this year brought up something really cool, and we're talking about Egypt right now. It's really fun. Talking about the monuments they built and how they have the pyramids, they have these temples that we still have. Thinking about it, our monuments will be our sports stadiums and our office buildings.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd say that City Museum, St. Louis.
Oh, hello. Dude, that's a great place.
Heck yeah, it is.
Look up the City Museum in St. Louis, Missouri. It's not a cathedral. No, it's not.
But it's incredible.
Cathedral to look up is the St. Louis Basilica. Beautiful place.
Has it been ordained?
I don't know.
I thought there was some controversy over that. Did the Pope actually manage to make it to St. Louis to...
I don't know, actually. You know what? We're pretty much done with the overview of cathedrals, so we're going to take a little break, and we're going to look this up and let you know, because now I'm really interested.
Yes.
We'll be right back.
Bye. For now.
And we're back. So we left you with that little question of if the Basilica in St. Louis was actually a cathedral.
Yes.
Found out, yes it is.
It is.
1997, it was designated as an actual cathedral, the Cathedral Basilica, by Pope John Paul II. He came to the United States in that year and decided to...
make it a cathedral.
Yeah.
Ordain it.
Ordain, that's a proper word, right?
I'm pretty sure that's the proper word.
Okay, yeah.
If it's not, roast us in all social media. Yeah,
destroy
us. Roast me.
Yeah, all that fun stuff.
Yes. So, on to the stuff that we love to make sure that we get to. I was very interested, and I didn't really cover this in my overview, but I was very surprised and interested in modern cathedrals, because this thought had never really occurred to me. Because with 3,054 cathedrals, some of those were not built back in the day. Some of those have been built very recently. And while Gothic and Romanesque are the most popular, I told you that it followed the art movement. So we had Baroque, we had Rococo.
Right.
But that means that we also kept going through the art movements, which moving up to modern, so we're talking, minimalism, interesting structures, interesting forms, like organic versus angular versus geometric. So shapes, man. They were playing with them, and it just is something that never had occurred to me. So you have obviously the iconic, beautiful cathedrals like the Notre Dame and the Sagrada Familia and the Hagia Sophia, but I really enjoyed looking at the cathedral in Brazil, the Brasilia Cathedral. It is a classic example of modernism architecture applied to cathedrals, which is something that had just never occurred to me. It's never occurred to me that they would do that with cathedrals, but it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, definitely. Go look this up. Most podcast apps can stay open when you're listening, so go look it up right now.
Leave us.
Brasilia Cathedral, right?
Yes. If that's too much, just cathedral in Brazil.
Yes, it'll likely come up.
Yes.
Along with that one is, we brought this up in the little pre-production, I think it's called something like the Lotus Cathedral. It's in Thailand or something like that. Super cool looking. So yeah, go look those up. and let us know what you think, because we think they're pretty
just,
awesome.
Just marvel. Be, I don't know, amazed, bewildered, whatever have you.
Be confused with me by looking up Notre Dame du Haut. It's very interesting. Another one of those Notre Dame ones in in France. And it's just kind of, I don't want to say funny looking, because it's really cool, but it's different. It's definitely more modern than the old cathedrals, but...
Yes, it's... this is a very famous cathedral in art communities. It is known as the Crab. I don't know why it's labeled the Crab, TBH. I have never thought it looked like a crab, but everybody calls it the Crab.
Never known any building to look like a crab.
It's the Crab. So if you have more questions, find your local art teacher, and they will be happy to explain to you all the intricacies of said cathedral. The Crab. But just also as an aside, I mentioned how we have modern cathedrals, and in our overview, I mentioned how a surefire way to tell a Romanesque cathedral from a Gothic cathedral is the arches. So if you have a round arch, that's Romanesque. If you have a pointed arch, that is Gothic. Well, you will probably also come across cathedrals which have a mixture of both, which would be very confusing. It's like, how am I supposed to label you? That is most likely a postmodern cathedral. So after modernism comes postmodernism, which postmodernism is basically just where we are today. So there's no real movement happening yet. We don't have a name for the movement. So with postmodern cathedrals, they have started to look back on the two most popular, which are Romanesque and Gothic, as we have been saying. And they decided, well, why don't we just blend these? Why don't we take the familiar, iconic imagery of cathedrals and put them in our cathedrals? Right. So you will find mixtures of Romanesque architecture and Gothic architecture.
Right, that makes total sense. I mean, take the good things of both, mix them together, can't be bad, right?
Yeah, and like we said, when we think of cathedrals, very specific buildings come to mind, very specific architecture, imagery. So you want to make sure that you really highlight that. So when people are walking around town, they go, oh, that is a cathedral.
Right. It almost harkens back to when it was just little small towns, and maybe it wasn't a cathedral per se, but sometimes the first thing you would see in, say, like medieval Europe, medieval England, whatever, would be this cathedral type structure. Like what we think of when we think cathedral, that was the landmark that they had. And now in today's day and age, we still have that, but they're trying to kind of bring it along a little bit. It's really fun.
Real fun.
So something I found really interesting was how much cathedrals played a role in wars and kind of still have, and how they've been affected by them, I guess. So, I mean, we talked about how, in times of war, cathedrals can be places of safety.
Yes.
But also that made them huge targets. So, that's just really interesting to me. Cathedrals were bombed a lot throughout the Blitz in England and just World War II and all of that. It was a lot for them to go through.
Yeah, well, even earlier than that, Anglo-Saxons, Norse coming through, raiding England.
Oh, yeah.
You want to hit the epicenters, so you show your power, your might, and you weaken the morale and take control of the city. So you would go for whatever their most important building was. So obviously in kingdoms, that is going to be the castle, but along the way, in the cities where the people are, what are the most important buildings? Cathedrals.
Right, and also those cathedrals would likely be super decorative, super ornate, and so they would have these precious things in there. And so it's not just attacking the morale, it's attacking their the wealth that they have in their town. And if you're raiding a town, that's kind of what you're going for.
Yeah, medievals didn't do that much because their cathedrals were broke at the time, but that was more so to just destroy the morale of the city.
Yeah, and that kind of leads in a little bit to another thing that I just found super interesting was the contrast between castles and cathedrals. Because you look at castles and they're these towering structures of they're solid as you get, right?
Yes.
Cathedrals weren't necessarily the opposite of it, but they were definitely on the other end of the spectrum. If you've ever been inside of a castle, like a castle ruin or whatever, highly recommend. It's super cool. It's dark. It is very, very dark. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you go into a Gothic cathedral and you look around and there is light everywhere. like from these windows, from these clerestories and the rose window and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
It's just super interesting to see that, yes, these existed at the same time, but the cathedrals is a direct kind of contrast to that, so they can let in more light, so they can let in more space and everything.
Yeah, well, that really harkened to kind of the purpose of a cathedral shifting to a cultural and religious epicenter.
Right.
How it was meant to inspire this awe and wonder, because Romanesque cathedrals would actually be often compared to castles,
Right?
because they were the same kind of stone stronghold, but instead of protecting the king, these strongholds were protecting the people.
Yeah, and that awe that they inspired, I read so many places that it was supposed to be the awe that comes with the presence of God, and it was supposed to be emulating that feeling, that sense, and it's pretty cool the way they went to achieve that with the ribbed ceilings and the vaults and all that stuff.
Yes, awe-inspiring and architecturally sound.
Oh yes, very
architecture
sound.
approved. Yeah, Gothic architecture was not just for looks and for pretty.
Oh no.
Like, yes, when you look at the glass, you think, okay, that's a little less secure. Those buildings were so much more structurally sound than early Romanesque cathedrals. Because Romanesque buildings were heavy. A lot of stone that's sitting on a lot of stone that doesn't enjoy all that weight. So the Gothic architecture was there to kind of help alleviate some of the pressure that this building is feeling. That's why they started getting so tall.
Right. They wanted to kind of show off a little bit, honestly. And I don't blame them.
No.
It's awesome. And yeah, you were talking about how structurally sound that they were. The cathedrals would literally have bombs dropped right on top of them. And yeah, they would lose ceilings sometimes and everything. But the general walls and the foundations would often remain intact.
Yeah.
There were a few times when a bomb literally just went through a ceiling of a cathedral and didn't blow up. And so they patched the hole and they're good.
Yeah.
Really fun stuff.
So something that I was a little confused about in my research, there appeared to be a sort of hierarchy of cathedrals, which I couldn't quite find what caused this hierarchy entirely. Obviously, it would have a little bit to do with the hierarchy of bishops, archbishops, what have you. But I couldn't tell if there was anything further. Like, the biggest thing I was ambiguous on is almost every cathedral is going to have a relic of some sort. So a relic, they are, long story short, connections between heaven and earth. That's the idea behind them.
Right,
they are, items that are able to bridge that gap. And so a cathedral will have these.
Often something that an apostle either owned or a piece of an apostle.
Yeah, so bones or, with the items, so articles of clothing or, thorns from Jesus' crown. Those are really big relics. So I couldn't tell if the relics helped arrange this hierarchy or if the relics were assigned because of the hierarchy. Just the hierarchy of cathedrals was something that really confused me.
Right, yeah, that's a very confusing topic, and that's going more into, I think, the Catholic faith and cathedrals.
Yeah, it has a little less to do with
sense.
the buildings. But as we have learned, the buildings are very closely tied to just having a pope. Not a pope, a bishop.
Yes.
Just everybody's got a pope in their cathedral.
Ooh, we don't need... Yikes. There were times in history when there were more than one pope, and it ended in wars.
They all
Let's not
excommunicated each other at the same time. I know that story.
Yep.
I don't know my history. I know that story.
That was a great time.
It's a great time.
Yeah.
History's fun, kids.
But hey, if you're out there and you're Catholic and you know this hierarchy, what designates where the relics go, or if the relics designate the hierarchy,
I would love to know.
Yeah. Email us. Let us know on social medias.
Inform me.
Something that I was confused about / interested in, we talked about Gothic cathedrals, we talked about Romanesque cathedrals. Then there's also Byzantine cathedrals.
Yes.
Which, if you know much about the Byzantine Empire, it's like the eastern end of the Roman Empire when Rome starts falling and everything. So they still have the Romanesque kind of look to them almost, but there's still a specific architectural style apparently called Byzantine, and I just don't know where that line is. What makes it Byzantine?
Yeah. And because everything we've said has kind of centered around Catholic cathedrals. And that kind of plays into, because while Byzantine architecture will play into Catholic cathedrals as well, it also blends into the other, branches of Christianity that will have bishops. So like I mentioned, how we have the Anglicans and the Eastern Orthodox and the Lutherans sometimes and other branches, they have cathedrals as well, and they have their own kind of architectural flair that they are adding to them. And I just couldn't find any information on it.
Right,
It's just all about the Catholic cathedrals, which they are very similar. Like, they're all branches of Christianity, so that makes sense. But wanting to find out just more, like, if there's any real difference, if there's any real explanation that needs to be given there, just couldn't find it.
Yeah. So again, let us know. Please do.
Let's say, if you know your things, tell us the things.
So going into this, something that I did not know but ended up learning was that kind of concept of a cathedral is made by it being the seat of the bishop.
Yeah.
And the whole, origin of that, with it being the cathedra, which is Latin for chair, even.
Yeah.
Being in the cathedral. That's super cool to me, and I love that sort of tradition that comes with that. That's just really cool to think about, and I had no idea about it till this week when we researched this.
Yeah, that really threw me for a loop, because, like I mentioned, I was like, the beautiful buildings, the giant grand windows,
Right,
and
yeah.
if it's not windows, giant buildings of stone and columns, like, it has to do with the building, right? Nope, not the building. It's the chair.
It is all the chair.
It's the chair.
But that's super cool.
That's awesome. That's the fun of learning things.
Exactly, yes. Learn all the things. Do yourself that favor.
So that about wraps us up for this week. So, as we mentioned, 4 to 12 hours, so we'll be doing that again. So for next week...
I'm scared.
Yes, my turn to pick a topic. My hint for Timothy,
all right,
and for the rest of you is...
And I don't know this one. Last week he knew what this topic would be. I have no idea.
Yes. So, obviously I will tell him after this, but he's going to try to guess.
Laugh at me. Go ahead.
Yes. So, when I was thinking of topics to give Timothy to talk about on this beautiful podcast, I was thinking, and then this particular topic came to mind, and I decided, you know what? I choose you. That's your hint.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh. Okay, well, I choose you. That could very well be a reference to Pokemon. So yeah, I'm going to go with... Okay. I'm going to go with not a Pokemon game. I think you want to talk about Detective Pikachu. And something with the animation in that.
Locking in?
Yeah, that's what I'm locking in.
He is locking in Detective Pikachu.
I know you were surprised by that movie, so... Or surprised.
It was a good movie.
Yeah.
If you haven't watched Detective Pikachu, go watch Detective Pikachu. It's pretty good.
Yeah.
But do you have any other ideas? You want to theorize any further?
Not really.
Not really?
Yeah, I have nothing else.
Wow.
I could say Pokemon game of some sort, but they're always coming out with a new one of those.
You're just sticking with Pokemon.
Yeah. You're making me nervous now. You're doing that on purpose.
Interesting.
Oh, hush. Okay.
All right, so the rest of you get to ponder that lovely hint, further theorize, do better than Timothy, and come up with more than just one possibility.
Please do.
Because he could be wrong.
I very well could be wrong.
Is he wrong?
Probably
You'll have to find out next week.
But in the meantime, look us up on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, at KYN Podcast.
Yes.
Or even on YouTube.
Yes. If you don't like our many podcast options,
right,
you will find us on YouTube. Or you could just go follow us on YouTube anyway, because you're a homie. So that's always an option.
Yes. Exactly. Be a homie.
Yes.
Be a homie with us.
Follow us everywhere.
Follow us, and if you want to correct us or, mention something to us about this episode, send us an email at kynpodcast@gmail.com.
Yeah. Or write it in the comments of the YouTube video. That's where the fights happen.
That's true. Do we want to condone fights?
I don't really know.
I don't think we do.
Don't actually fight, kids.
Yeah, no. It's not worth it.
No.
It's not fun.
Yeah. If you go to our main page at Anchor FM, you can find all the places you can listen to us on podcasts if your Spotify subscription ended or something.
Right.
So We are on multiple platforms. You will be able to find us wherever you want.
Link in the description.
Link in the description.
The above.
Yes.
Anchor FM/KYN podcast.
/KYN podcast.
All right.
That's a wrap.
On Cathedrals.
On Cathy's.
Cathy's. We are not keeping that in the final cut.
Why not? Okay, that's our final wrap on Cathedrals. As he said, boring.
We're not calling them Cathy's.
Bye!